A little bit about my company, water flood concepts, our methodology. Then I'll be passing the floor over to Deanna Goldstein to talk about Devon property specifically, and then there'll be questions. And then there'll be questions and answers afterwards. At this point, I'll just make a distinction. I look at the specifics of analyzing water flood using OFM, where Deanna looks more at your company Pacific surveillancing daily operations. The engineering focus here, and what I'll be trying to present is we analyze reservoirs performance to predict underperforming wells, injectors or producers. I also look for predicting regions of the reservoirs for infill drilling or injection conversions. And the primary tool that I'm presenting here is OFM. We do this using statistical analysis with OFM. Craiging techniques is one of the mapping procedures in OFM, and with Craiging, I do a lot of regression analysis, mainly with Excel. If I need more additional statistical analysis, I have an expert statistical person that I consult. From that, using the statistical data, we look at we analyze petrophysical data, pressure data, history, and the purpose is to optimize hydrocarbon recovery and ultimately to make money. Previous studies, presently I'm doing a lot of work with Arsenal Energy in the Provost area, analyzing their pools. I worked internationally in Bangladesh, which was a non-associated gas pool. I've done some work with Devon in the past, and prior to consulting, I worked for CNRL on the Nipissing and Grand Forks reservoirs. And I started my career with Petro-Canada, working on Golden Lake, Belso Lake, Wapiti, and a little bit of exposure to Williston Green. The objectives of water flood. I was asked by Louis when preparing this presentation to just give an overview of water flooding. The primary objectives of water flood, there are three perspectives. The main one is to maintain the pressure of the reservoir above the bubble point to keep gas in solution, and to minimize viscosity by keeping gas in solution. The second objective is the physical displacement of oil by water, and we look at managing the voidage replacement ratio. I'll be talking a little bit more about that later, and so will Deanna in her presentation. And again, we're looking at optimizing oil recovery. This is a pressure, temperature, phase envelope, and the key things that we're looking for, if we know our pressure, it's assumed temperature is pretty constant, and this is the area of the pressure, temperature envelope there. It's most optimal for water flood. One of the things we need to watch is we don't get too far into the gas zone, because if there's too much gas production, then it short circuits the efficiency of the reservoir. I'm going to be presenting a lot of information. As you can see, I have this presentation being video recorded, and the slides will be put on my website. So if there's information I'm going too quickly, you'll be able to review it after the presentation. So criteria for water flooding. There are three main criteria that we look at. One is the geology, the permeability, porosity, water saturation, and the heterogeneity of the reservoir. Depending on how complex the reservoir is, some reservoirs can be modeled using the Butley-Leverett procedure. If it's very heterogeneous, complex, we have multi-layer models. Nowadays, most complex models are done using simulation, not analytically. The second criteria is gas saturation. S prime, we're talking about this is the saturation at the beginning of the water flood. The saturation at the beginning of the water flood needs to be less than the critical saturation in order for the maximum efficiency of the water flood. And the procedure how to do that is discussed in Craig's monograph. And most of the information, if not all, is taken out of Craig's monograph. The third point for criteria is looking at your mobility ratios. The ideal case, we're looking between 0.3 and 10. The ideal situation is ultimately 1. There are 4 stages of water flooding. There's the start of injection to interference, which is basically measured through build-up or drawdown tests. From interference to fill-up, from fill-up to breakthrough, and then from breakthrough to the economic flood-out limit. And in an ideal situation, piston displacement, the injection rate initially is 2 times the oil production at reservoir conditions, and once you reach fill-up, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Obviously, when you look at your voyage replacement numbers, these numbers will change with each reservoir. The recovery factor, we're looking at the displacement efficiency multiplied by the volumetric sweep efficiency. The displacement efficiency is 1 minus the residual oil saturation minus the condensate water saturation. These points are measured on your relative permeability curves, all divided by 1 minus the condensate water saturation. And then our volumetric sweep efficiency is the aerial sweep efficiency multiplied by the vertical sweep efficiency. I'm not going to go into the equations for these two, but graphically you can see if you have an injector in the middle, you've got water going in. This is the aerial sweep efficiency cartoon. This is the vertical. This area here would be considered the flood front. If you have your relative permeability to oil ahead of the flood front, in the ideal case it's a constant. Behind the flood front, it's a variable. And these will be talked about more when I get into the relative permeability curves. Ultimately, what we're looking for is a method to determine our remaining oil in place once we start a water flood. There's 2 main things that we look at: our water saturation. The end point is going to be the economic point. Beyond this point, it's no longer economic to move the water. And the other variable we look at is our total formation volume factor. And I'll be talking about both of these later in the presentation. So once you're through various methods, we know the original oil in place, and ultimately we're looking for the recovery factor at different points within the water flood. This could be at the start of the water flood, this could be at breakthrough, this could be at your economic limit. It all depends on where you want to measure your saturation point. This is a graph of the Ferrier Unit 2. I did back in 2010 is when I did work on this area. You can see that the unit is divided into a whole bunch of different patterns. And back then, each pattern had a name. And so what I did is I took the area for each pattern, used a perimeter, calculated the pay, porosity, saturation, and used these for the volumetrics, and then the permeability was used later on and for statistical analysis for some other work we had done. So when you looked at the unit, this is the oil production rate. The black curve is the number of wells on production at the time. We have the water cut, and this is the water saturation calculated through Buckley-Larrick method. And you can see that here this saturation is fairly constant along this area, and this is for the whole pool. But when you look at it on an aerial perspective, this, the graph that should have been there is out of place. I'll get back to that. There's a graph that's missing. I'll be later in the slide. I moved it, but for some reason it didn't get into this particular slide. But I'll be referring to the water saturation a little bit later in the presentation. When I refer to it, I'm referring to this curve here. So the next concept is the voidage replacement ratio. Essentially, it's the water injected at reservoir conditions divided by the total fluid produced at reservoir conditions. And then we have the voidage replacement ratio, which is basically the same equation, but it's a summation. And what we want is we want the voidage replacement ratio ideally at 1. This is just a pressure profile of the unit. The light blue curve is the average for this particular sort of wells. So each pattern would have its own average. And the reservoir itself, if you look at the PVT analysis for this reservoir, was just under 2,200 kPa. This next slide is just the lab data so you have your formation volume factor, oil formation factor in green. You have the gas in red and water in blue. And you can combine all three to give your total formation volume factor. And this is which is what's programmed within OFM. So, and I'll just mention the whole point of this analysis was to take the concept presented in Craig's monograph and convert it so it can be used in OFM. And that's part of what I do with the presentation. So essentially, fractional flow analysis, their definition is the total water produced divided by the total fluid produced. As you can see, if you multiply the top and bottom curve by Darcy's law, you get this equation. So the water cancels out to 1, and this green area represents the fractional flow for oil, and then the fractional flow for gas. Above the bubble point, this component goes away, and so this part here that's not crossed out is the typical equation used by Buckley-Larrett in his original analysis. I'm taking this one step further later on in the presentation for oil to see how this can be used within OFM. Here is the relative permeability curves. We have the relative permeability to oil here in green, the relative permeability to water. One of the things to note here is it's a scale from 0 to 1 for water saturation. It's the inverse. It would be 0 to 1 for oil saturation because oil is 1 minus water. And I'm making a point of that because when I show the relative permeability to gas later on, this scale will be inverted. And one of the things too is in order to take this field into OFM, I modeled these curves using statistical techniques. So these equations are modified and put into OFM so we can use it as a predicting tool within the database. This is your typical fractional flow curve. In theory, this in the data books, this is more characteristic of an S. Here you can see it's almost a straight line, and what this is representing is because as you put a line tangentially to this yellow curve and extrapolate it to point 1, this point here is the average water saturation according to Buckley-Larrett theory behind the flood front. So you can see from this point here, this reservoir is producing very well. It's one of the best reservoir theoretical data that I have seen for producing. And so one of the things you can do, if you know the fractional flow equation, and if you know your economic cutoff limit, you can go back to this equation and you can figure out at your economic limit what your oil saturation is left in the ground. And from that, you can use your volumetrics, calculate how much oil you have. And then within OFM, you can do decline analysis, and you can compare decline analysis with volumetrics within the same tool. As presented earlier, there was a slide where I said the water saturation was out of place. This is the slide I was looking for. This is the water saturation as it goes from connate water saturation to the residual oil saturation. The areas in dark blue is starting to become higher water. So these areas here are going to water out quicker within this particular reservoir, which is the Ferrier. So what I'll go into next is our methodology. And so I look at production forecasts using for fractional flow analysis, and that's coming up. OFM scatter plots, production trends, aerial maps, individual well production analysis, regional production analysis, and then inadequate injection support identification and injector wells. And again, I want to point out that all this will be on my web page with the video, so if I'm going too fast, you'll be able to review it at your leisure. So going back to the fractional flow equations, This is here, I'm talking now in terms of oil, where before we were talking water. Buckley-Larrett theory with traditional water. This has been modified here for OFM. And I'm presently talking to Anne Valentine, who is Schlumberger's principal instructor for OFM internationally. And we're talking about taking this concept into a technical paper. And there's nothing new here. It's taking the same equations, modifying it so it can be used within OFM. So we can use fractional flow equations as a predicting tool for the remaining life of a water flood. So essentially here, where before this term went to 0 in the water flood when we had the fractional flow to water, now we're keeping this term for the fractional flow for the gas term. So as a result, we have the relative permeability to oil for the gas, as well as the relative permeability to the gas. And as you can see, the scale is from 0 to 1. So the endpoints here have, for both curves, they need to match at the same point in order for the data to be the same. So here, the saturation to oil, the residual saturation to oil is roughly 35%, and at the water saturation, it goes to roughly 90%. I don't have the precise numbers in my head, but you can read off the scale what the relative oil saturations are. And the advantage of doing that is, since I was able to use numerical or statistical techniques, now what I have is we have a formation fractional flow for oil as a function of the water saturation. We have a curve using statistical techniques to model into the water flood. And now from here, I have the fractional flow of water right here. So we can see from there are 3 fractional flows. There's oil, gas, and water. And the sum of the 3 have to add to 1. This first one is water. And you can see that there's very little water showing up. And this is measured at the well, not in the reservoir. This is what the well sees. You can, the wells are just starting to see water production. Oil, similar before, we're starting to see the fractional flow to oil here. So these areas where dark blue are going to be the first wells that are going to water out. And then the next slide for gas, you can see this area here, there's high gas fractional flow to gas here. This tells me that this area is probably needing more pressure support, or else the gas wouldn't be coming out of solution. This next graph here is it's very busy, but I put it in here on purpose, even though it is busy, because what it's showing is the green curve is the oil production and a possible forecast. The blue curve here is your oil rate. So we know what our water rate and we know what the oil rate is. What I wanted to point out is you have these three curves, the fractional to gas, fractional flow to oil, and to water. The 3 have to add up to 1. So this is gas, this is oil, and this is water. And you can see the fractional flow to water is just starting on a field basis to increase. Simultaneously, I have the oil saturation plotted, and the oil saturation is just starting to come down. So for this reservoir, and this is on the field basis, so this can be broken down to the pattern, individual groupings, whatever grouping you want to look at. And you can see that as the saturation of oil starts to go down, you can use this as a tool volumetrically to work with your decline analysis. So you're able to compare decline and volumetric simultaneously to predict what your ultimate oil recovery will be. And using this saturation, you can see previously, I'll just point out, you can see this is still pretty high, almost at the residual oil saturation, because this is what the well sees, not the reservoir. And it's just starting to go down. So these wells here that are blue are still high, and they're going to start going down to red. And as they go down, as you're able to measure how these are going down, you'll be able to see in the reservoir which wells are watering out, which wells are going to be economic. This next slide is another concept. It's built in OFM. And what you're showing here is a very busy scattered plot. On this axis, is your water cut is increasing, and your oil rate is increasing this way. So what you're looking at is this quadrant here. This is your high water cut, high oil producers. This is your low water cut, high oil producers. So these are your money makers in green. This is your low oil cut, low water cut, low oil producers. So these wells are either suspended or are not getting pressure support. These are your high water cut, low oil producers. So these are the wells most likely increasing your operating costs. And so, now each one of these quadrants can be split into another quadrant as many times as is practical to determine where your money makers are versus where your high expense wells are. And all of these wells are shown here. So you can see the low oil wells, low water cut, low oil wells that tends to be on the edge. They are not getting the water support. And so one of the things I look at in the analysis is where are your underperforming wells or underperforming areas of the reservoir. And this tool allows me to do that quite easily. This is just a data collection very similar to before. The only point is that for each individual pattern with this information, I can calculate a recovery factor for each pattern. So what we have here is we have the recovery factor increasing on the y-axis versus hydrocarbon pore volume of water injected. So essentially, you can see the wells here, they're injecting a lot of water with very little recovery factor. So I can compare, and this black line in the middle is the average pattern. So I can tell which wells here are producing better within the reservoir, which patterns are producing better within the reservoir, and which patterns are worse. And again, this is for the full field. In actual analysis, these would be breaking down into subcategories and to find why. This well here is like I would want to know why this well is taking so much water and not producing any recovery. There's likely cycling going on of some sort. This is a Hall plot, and so here this is a running sum of your days on production multiplied by the pressure of a month. So this is a pressure time curve on the y-axis. This is cumulative water injection. So as you can see at this point here for this pressure time and this point here for this pressure time, this well took much more water versus this well. So from an injectivity perspective, this injector is much better than this injector. Why? It could be either skin or it could be the permeability of the reservoir. More analysis would have to be done. Now within this injector itself, you can see that this started to go up tangentially, and then at this point, somebody did some kind of stimulation and this well started to improve its curve. So with the Hall plot, we can see wells relative to each other and also relative to itself. So here's another example where somebody did a stimulation on an injector. This last plot is not Ferrier. Up to now, I was showing everything with Ferrier data. This is a different reservoir. And all I wanted to show here is what this reservoir, this was a pool, had 2 injectors and 5 producers. And I created out of those 5 injectors a type curve. So what I was able to generate, the area under this curve for the 5 producers all created 100,000 barrels incremental oil. And so within OFM, we can easily see if you do any kind of workover, if you want to compare fracs, if you want to compare changing of pumps, if you want to compare any work that you have data, we can create type curves and see what the economic incremental reserves are for that work. There's only a couple of slides left. What I did in the year 2010 study, I wanted to look at wells that were within the reservoir, which wells were producing good versus bad relative to the average reservoir or well in the field. So what we have here is an error which is a prediction technique where I knew the actual production of the wells. I predicted using statistical methods multiplied by the actual 100%, and then I graphed it in a scale between negative 20% to positive 20%, where the green in the middle is the perfect fit. So you can see the blue areas are overperforming, likely due to pressure support of the water flood. The red areas are underperforming, either due to lack of pressure support or skin effects. I did it in 3 regressions, totaling out of 139 wells. I was able to fit 77 wells, plus or minus 20%. The remaining wells, 16 were underperforming. I was able to identify which 16 wells they were, and then the remaining 47 wells were overperforming. And so this was what I initially did the analysis for, is to try and find which wells within the reservoir are underperforming, so you know where you want to spend your time for doing workovers. And the procedure, how this done, well, this is the statistical limitations I'll discuss first. The regression equations are only valid for the data set analyzed. So attention needs to be put into inputs, especially modeling the relative permeability curves. The statistical models are iterative. As I showed, I did 3 iterations for finding the optimal wells that were, or the wells that were underperforming. And at the end of the data set, each data set requires individual analysis. You can't generalize one well. I can't take the results from failure and just arbitrarily put to another reservoir. I can take the procedure to another reservoir, but not the data. And the procedure essentially is a paper I co-authored with Ron Forth and Bruce Savitsky at Petro-Canada, and at the time I was at the University of Calgary, and my co-author is Leon Fedenchuk. I mentioned there's a statistician person that I contact. If the stats are greater than what I can do, he has his PhD in statistics, and he's a consultant that I consult when necessary. And so this paper was first presented in 1995 in Banff, and then it was published in 1996, and the procedures are still valid today. And from here, I'll pass the floor on to Deanna.